Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for coming to today's webinar event, which is sponsored by the Yale Center for the Study of Representative Institutions. I'd like to especially thank Hira Jaffrey and my fellow postdoc, Brendan Shanahan, for their work in helping coordinate this event and the series it is a part of. And I'd also like to thank our YCRA co-directors, Stephen Smith and Isaac Nakamowski, for their support of our virtual programming in these strange times. This is the second installment in a series of events that's going to broadly address the theme of presidentialism in America, the changing politics of executive power. Before I introduce our speakers, I do want to note that our next event in this series is going to be on Thursday, November 12th at 4 p.m., at which Verlin Lewis will be speaking about his book, Ideas of Power, The Politics of American Party Ideology Development. Please also keep your eye out for announcements of more events on this theme for next semester. The relationship between President Donald Trump and the Republican Party has been a subject of continued fascination and study during the last few years. Many political observers have debated the extent to which the president has turned the Republican Party into the Trump Party. The party's recent choice to not draft a new party platform in 2020 and instead to simply offer support for the president's agenda was one particularly symbolic indicator of Trump's takeover of his party. At the same time, however, since 2016, a disaffected group of Republicans has declined to support the president under the motto, Never Trump. Affiliated groups now, like the Lincoln Project and Republican Voters Against Trump, have gained a lot of attention in this 2020 presidential election. So at a critical time like this, it is important for us to reflect on what the last 4 years have meant for American politics and for the future of our two-party system. And here to help us in that endeavor are the authors of Never Trump, The Revolt of the Conservative Elites, published recently by Oxford University Press. It's my pleasure to introduce two great scholars of American political development and the authors of this fantastic book, Robert Selden and Stephen Tellis. Rob Selden is professor of political science and a Mansfield Center Fellow at the University of Montana. He is also the author of When Bad Policy Makes Good Politics and War, the American State and Politics Since 1898. He's also a frequent contributor to the popular press, having written for outlets such as the Washington Post and National Affairs. Stephen Tellis is professor of political science at the Johns Hopkins University and a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center. He is the author of The Captured Economy, How the Powerful Enrich Themselves, Slow Down Growth, and Increase Inequality, Prison Break, Why Conservatives Turned Against Mass Incarceration, The Rise of the Conservative Legal Movement, and Whose Welfare? He has also written widely in a number of general interest publications, including The Nation, Democracy, The Washington Monthly, The American Prospect, and National Review. To our audience, Rob and Steve are going to present on their book for the next 40 minutes or so, after which we'll proceed to Q&A. Please feel free to send in your questions using the Q&A function, both during the presentation and afterwards. And also this event is being recorded. Rob and Steve, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thanks, John. Really appreciate you having us. I think I'm going to take the opening comments for the most part, unless I slip up and make a big mistake, and then Steve will jump in and save us. Right, this book is about the Never Trumpers, these Republicans and conservatives who opposed Trump in 2016 during the primaries and in the general election, and in many cases continue to do so today. It's largely based on some 80 in-depth interviews that we conducted with all the key players. So I thought what I'd do is say a word about what drew us to the project initially, and then speak to our understanding of Never Trump, which we see as more than anything else as a party phenomenon. And then I'll wrap up by noting several of our takeaways. So first, just in terms of what drew us to the project, I mean, part of it was just the obvious that the Never Trump phenomenon is a great story. It's unprecedented, and that's what really prompted the core question of the book, which is why did this set of dedicated partisans react to their own party's nominee, to their own party's president in this unprecedented way? And it really was, I think, remarkable. Opposing your own party's nominee is a big deal. They went scorched earth. They pulled out all the stops. They, first desperately tried to coalesce behind a single Republican alternative in the primaries. Once they realized, too late, as it turned out, that Trump had the potential to win, they later released a series of letters in opposition to Trump that were signed by some of the party's A-list policy experts. They orchestrated a barrage of critical opinion pieces that ran in leading media outlets. Probably most notably here was a full issue of National Review, the leading conservative intellectual magazine that was dedicated to opposing Trump in kind of a symposium format with a range of critical pieces from leading conservative figures. The Never Trumpers also plotted to deny Trump the nomination on the floor of the Republican National Convention. And then finally, they had this whole process of trying to recruit a third-party challenger to run for president in the hopes that they could throw the thing to the House of Representatives, or even for some of them to Hillary Clinton. And that's a whole story into itself. And there were a number of near misses with some very high-profile people who might very well have shaken up the race back in 2016 before they settled on Evan McMullin. So these activities, I guess another thing that's important to note maybe here at the beginning is just that these activities carried significant consequences. The people who engaged in Never Trump activities, these were people who were in line for political appointments in the next Republican administration. These were people who'd made their living from inside the party, and in many cases, whose ability to pay their mortgages and just basic things like that was contingent on staying in the good graces of the party. These are also people whose personal sense of identification, both professional and personal, was tied up in being a Republican and in being a conservative. So for a lot of Never Trumpers, opposing the Republican nominee, it threatened their financial well-being. It ended up hurting their career trajectory in many cases. And it was just a jarring personal experience for a lot of these folks, in which they had this sense of feeling betrayed by their longtime friends, their longtime comrades in arms. They had the sense of finding themselves alone in the foxhole. Many of them lost dear friends. And in fact, the whole experience was so traumatic for some of these Never Trumpers that we spoke with that there were a handful of occasions when our conversations with them actually came to almost resemble something more like a therapy session than a normal interview. So all this is to say, this is not normal. This is not the way things usually go. And this was all quite intriguing to Steve and I. And certainly one of the things that drove us to this project. And what we tried to do is to understand basically why some elite level Republicans and conservatives went Never Trump, and why others, who in a lot of cases were in very seemingly similar positions, right? Why did some go Never Trump and others not? Others looked at the exact same situation and they were fine with it. And indeed, they looked on those who went Never Trump as crazed hysterics. So that's one piece that drew us to it. I think the other key launching pad that's probably worth mentioning is that just the way that Steve and I understand political parties and their place in liberal democracies. And for a lot of that, we're indebted to our mentors. Steve and I both studied at the University of Virginia. And I think that influence, and probably in particular, the influence of folks like Jim Caesar and Martha Durthick and Sid Milkis, that's probably very evident in the book, and served in some respects as a launching point for this project. So basically, liberal democracy, we think it's not just some kind of default situation that will inevitably endure. Democracy has its own set of weaknesses, and these weaknesses can be exploited. And as such, democracy needs its defenders. It needs institutions to provide support structures. And we think political parties are one of these key essential mediating institutions that helps maintain the health of liberal democracy. So, they provide some of the structures, some of the guardrails that channel democracy in more positive directions, in more healthy directions, in that they play a filtering role that pushes back against some of those pathologies that over the long course of human history have plagued and often destroyed democracies. So one of the reasons Steve and I were drawn to the Never Trump phenomenon, because basically we looked at that and we saw the 2016 election cycle as effectively witnessing the collapse of one of these mediating institutions that supports a healthy democracy, namely the Republican Party. So one way of looking at what happened 4 years ago is that you had elite level Republicans who tried but failed to filter out a candidate who represented in many respects a rejection of the party's core principles, who in many ways embodied the kind of classical demagogue that the founders, among others, worried about, right? It was a type of scenario that the American party system was at least partially designed to avoid. So again, those are the things that initially intrigued us about the Never Trump phenomenon. Why don't I now say a few words just about how we understand these Never Trumpers, our framework for presenting them in the book. And probably the first thing to say is just simply that we don't think that Never Trump was a single thing, right? It was, there are a number of different stories here. It also never centered on elected officials, right? There certainly were some, and Mitt Romney obviously is one. There are a number of others, most of whom are who are now out of work. But the white hot core of Never Trump, where the real action was, it wasn't with elected officials. It was found within networks of professionals within the Republican Party, right? So we're talking here about the policy experts who would normally be appointed to political positions at the State Department, Pentagon, National Security Council, Treasury, the White House itself. Never Trump was found among political professionals who run Republican campaigns. The folks, John, that you mentioned, associated with the Lincoln Project, Republican Voters Against Trump, right? That whole set of people. It was also found among the public intellectuals, the people who formulate and disseminate the party's ideas and philosophy. So, columnists like George Will and David Brooks and Jen Rubin, Weekly Standard editor Bill Kristol, that whole set of individuals. And that gets to one of the core kind of political science-y contributions that we hope this project can make to our understanding of political parties. So when we're conceiving of these individuals associated with Never Trump, when we're conceiving of them as party actors, and when we're framing Never Trump as a party phenomenon, I think we're suggesting a somewhat broader understanding of political parties than has been typical. So political scientists have often seen parties as teams of ambitious office seekers or coalitions of interest groups and activists, but a lot of these accounts actually overlook a lot of activity that can, and Steve and I certainly think should, be understood as partisan. So in particular, some of the standard political science definitions of parties, they leave out a lot of the people who came to comprise the Never Trump movement, people who provide a range of professional services, essential services for political parties. And we identify three types of services in particular. The first of these is just running a modern campaign, right? Running a modern campaign requires the services of a whole set of professionals, right? The people, the comms people, the people who do ads, the people who do mailers, and so on and so on. And there are thousands of these people in the Republican Party, thousands of these people who run Democratic campaigns. So it's a whole network with its own hierarchies and things like that. A second essential network, a second essential service that needs to be provided is simply staffing the bureaucracy, right? By filling the several thousand jobs required for political appointees. And filling these roles requires the services of a set of professionals, policy experts. Especially important are national security experts, economists, and lawyers. And then the third essential network, the third essential task that has to be carried out for political parties is generating ideas, right? So our thinking here is that parties have certain structures in place for the development and the enforcement of ideological orthodoxy. So you've got this whole network of people, people housed in magazines and think tanks and universities, and these people play a gatekeeping role in determining, which ideological concepts, which policies become associated with their party. So we organize the book around these networks, and we call them collectively the extended party. And so we have a couple chapters on national security professionals. We have a couple chapters on political operatives. We have a couple chapters on public intellectuals. And we have a chapter on lawyers and a chapter on economists. And each of these, and this is where we get to the thing, there's no single story. There's no one single thing that was never Trump. Each of these networks has its own unique story. Just very briefly, maybe to give you a little bit of a flavor for this, the Foreign Policy Network is the one that stands out as the most cohesive, right? Those folks hung together. They put out a series of letters that were signed on to by dozens, and in one case, well over 100 people who work in this space. They were also very unforgiving to those who broke ranks, right? Who went pro-Trump at one point or another. And then we contrast that with the political operatives, right? And they had a very different trajectory. In that world of political operatives, the vast majority of them started off as never Trumpers. But once it became clear who the nominee was going to be, these people found themselves in this position of kind of having to frantically delete their anti-Trump tweets and things like this to preserve their standing in the party. So the few political operatives who hung with their never Trump stance, those people, unlike the foreign policy folks, those people in the political operative world who stayed never Trump, they were the ones who really kind of came to find themselves alone in the foxhole back in 2016, right? And so each of these networks has its own story, and we go into those in each of those in great depth in the book. But to just try to make some points about what kind of unifying stories can be told across the spectrum of these various groups. Obviously, Steve and I, we're trained as political scientists. So we're trained to look for structural explanations for a lot of this stuff. And we certainly found plenty of that. And again, we go into that in great depth in each of these chapters. But it's also probably worth emphasizing that we would be doing something of a disservice to the people that we talk to if we simply chalked everything up to intragroup dynamics or economic considerations or what have you. There was also just we think a simple element of personal choice that was at work. And David Frum, the former Bush speechwriter, the guy who coined the phrase axis of evil after 9/11. He's now a staff writer at The Atlantic. he kind of put it in a memorable way, and I'm paraphrasing this here, but he said something to the effect of, look, some people have a strong disgust reflex, and the line of separation is between those who are able to swallow the toad and those who have not been able to swallow the toad for whatever reason it might be, right? And so, Steve and I do think there's something to that, and yet there are some characteristics that cut across various subgroups that make up the Never Trump world. So let me just spin out a few of those factors. So first, and this goes back to what I was saying about how Steve and I conceive of political parties. In 2016, Never Trumpers very much thought that part of their role within the party was to serve a gatekeeping function, right? That it was their job, it was their responsibility as good Republicans, as good conservatives, to separate the clean from the unclean, right? To say who was a respectable Republican and who was not a respectable Republican, right? To patrol the boundaries of respectable conservatism. And when Trump emerged as a serious candidate, they saw a threat to their understanding of what the GOP stood for and what conservatism stood for. And more than anything, they saw that kind of demagogic figure, right? The kind of popular leader who destroys democracies by dividing society to his personal benefit, playing to the worst impulses in the citizenry, this kind of thing. And in the past, the kind of gatekeeping effect that the Never Trumpers undertook had often succeeded. And in fact, conservatives have this whole narrative of their own movement's history that basically consists of a series of purges, right? Of kicking out undesirable or unacceptable elements. So the classic example here is probably William F. Buckley, the famed editor of National Review, kicking out the John Birch Society, right? Kicking him out, reading him out of the conservative movement, right? Happened back in the early 1960s. But that was only one of many, right? There were all these other purges to cast out various racists and anti-Semites and so on, right? Again, and the kind of patrolling the borders of what is acceptable conservatism, what's acceptable republicanism. So, fast forward to 2016, the idea of saving the party and saving the movement from a sinister outsider who would discredit it, that was something that was very accessible. It was something that was familiar to those who went Never Trump. And it was built into their understanding of the party and of the movement's DNA. Again, just very accessible to them, right? That's something that felt familiar in their understanding of what it meant to be a good Republican, a good conservative who's out protecting those institutions. So when Trump came along, he appeared to encapsulate all of the non-respectable traits that they thought had been effectively purged from the party. In earlier purges, right? The crude populism, the demagoguery, the nativism, the race baiting, and so on. But in an era in which the formal party structures had grown weaker, in which the party's voters, rather than the party leaders, were the ones who chose nominees, well, their ability to filter out a toxic outsider, it failed. If you're a believer, as Steve and I are, that parties have an important role to play in liberal democracy, this is a concern that has implications far beyond 2016 and 2020. So a second item here is that those who went Never Trump, they were also much more likely to have been involved with a particular project. A project of diversifying the Republican Party. And this extended back some time, but it was especially prominent in the years leading up to 2016. So after the big disappointment of 2012, right? That was an election that a lot of Republicans felt like was there for the taking. And obviously it didn't work out the way they wanted. But there was this major push by some Republicans in the aftermath of 2012 to reach out to minority voters, to women, right? To diversify the party, right? The most obvious example of this, the most high profile example, was the so-called autopsy that was undertaken by the Republican National Committee. But there was more to it. But that was the most visible thing. And again, the whole point of this was to diversify the party, make outreach efforts to minority groups, women. And this was undertaken for a couple of reasons. One, you talk to these people, they saw it as a moral imperative, right? This was just the right thing to do. But it wasn't just that. It was also a practical necessity, right? Because they looked at their voter base, who are the people who are voting Republicans, and it's shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. Mike Murphy, one of the party's celebrity consultants, the way he put it was white ship sinking. And the idea was you got to get more people. Otherwise, the party is going down. And so for those invested in that project, Trump represented just a total repudiation of their professional assessment, for one, right? Their professional assessment that the GOP had to diversify, right? Trump came along and not only said, well, we aren't going to worry much about diversifying the party, but also we're going to double down and make it kind of push in the opposite direction, right? So these were the people, the Never Trumpers operating in this space who had put their professional reputations on the line, making the argument that the party absolutely has to diversify if it's going to win elections. Right, so Trump comes along and undermines that. He also, of course, undermined all the work that these people had put into the diversity project for all these years. Right, I mean, these are people whose, in many cases, their job had been to come up with plans, come up with programs to reach out to these various groups. Well, of course, they're mortified when Trump comes along and just destroys all that hard work. But again, that was one kind of unifying theme that maybe didn't speak to everyone in the Never Trump world, but was certainly a very, very common outlook that the party had to diversify. A third kind of consistent string is that those who went Never Trump tended to have the professional and financial flexibility to do so. And this explanation, I think, helps us understand some of those, say, in the foreign policy network and how they differ from those who are people who work in the political operative world, right? So a lot of the foreign policy experts, right, these are people who have other sources of income and other outlets for their professional interest, right? These are people who have jobs in think tanks and universities and magazines. And that's not to say, of course, it's still the case that for these people, the chance to serve on the National Security Council or to be a political appointee at the State Department, right? These are career highlights that's a lot to give up. They're also the kind of things that often lead to very lucrative opportunities after you leave government. So don't mean to totally dismiss those kinds of things, but yet the foreign policy experts have fallback options, right? They aren't going to be begging for quarters at the Greyhound station because of their Never Trump activity, right? They're still going to be able to pay their mortgage. That is not the case for the vast majority of people who work in the political operative world, right? Those folks do not have the kind of fallback opportunities that foreign policy experts and economists and lawyers have. So the political operatives who held firm as Never Trumpers, right? Which again, ultimately wound up being a small minority of that network. But for the most part, the ones in that world, the Mike Murphys, the Stuart Stevens, right? The people, for the most part, in the political operative world who did stick to their guns on Never Trump, these were the people who had the financial flexibility to walk away, right? They'd made a lot of money. They tended to be older. They didn't need to do it anymore. They had other outlets too, as TV pundits and things like this. So, but I guess that's not an option for the vast majority of people who run campaigns, right? They don't have those kinds of opportunities that Stevens and Murphy and those types do. One final thing I'll point out here. There is, we think, something of a religious component at work. So it's pretty obvious that Jews and Mormons are way overrepresented in the Never Trump ranks. And obviously there are plenty of non-Jewish and non-Mormon Never Trumpers too. But we don't think it's a total coincidence that these kind of two odd bedfellows, Jews and Mormons, are overrepresented. And one of the things we think is at work here is that there's something shared by these two groups, and that is a shared history of communal destruction. Right. So clearly, the Holocaust is a well-known central touchstone for the Jewish community, but there's a similar shared kind of ritualized history in the Mormon experience too. Right, dating back to the extermination order and Joseph Smith, the experience of being treated as fanatics and forced to relocate and all of this. So both groups have in their communal history an awareness that things can go very badly and that things can go very badly very quickly. A stable society isn't inevitable. And that's something that we found that people in these communities were able to access very easily. And that way of thinking about Trump's rise just came out so clearly in a number of the interviews we conducted. So just one day in particular that I recall where Steve and I talked about this, and it really stood out, was a day we were in Manhattan and we went to the New York Times and we interviewed Bret Stephens there. And the first thing out of Stevens's mouth was Holocaust analogy. And Hitler and everything, and that was common with a lot of people we spoke with, and it had all the caveats and asterisks. Well, look, this isn't literally Nazi Germany, and we're a long ways from that. But the point is that was super accessible for these people, right? Stevens had a way of putting it. I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but he said, that this is the kind of thing that your grandmother warned you about when you were a kid. So it's there and accessible in a way that I think it isn't for everyone. And so right after we talked with Stevens, we went over to National Review's headquarters and talked with Rich Lowry. And Rich Lowry, who was definitely not Jewish and not Mormon. We kind of pressed him, Steve especially. Steve and I have slightly different interviewing approaches, but Steve kind of likes to push people a little bit more than I do, and he really kind of pushed Lowry on this point. And it's like, basically trying, like, can't you see that there are reasons to be concerned here, and do you worry at all that things could kind of spin out of control? And Lowry basically couldn't. That just wasn't something that he bought into at any level. And so that was the day, probably more than any other, when that distinction, just on the religious dimension and that cultural dimension, really stood out to us as something that couldn't just be dismissed as an idiosyncratic thing. So I think maybe I'll leave it there. Though I guess maybe one other point I should mention that in the conclusion of the book, we do spend some time looking to the future, and we spin out one possible scenario, what we think would be a good scenario for the Never Trumpers moving forward. We kind of implicit in that is a criticism of the Never Trumpers and what they've done since 2016. But we'd be happy to get into any of that if there's interest. But again, I think I'll leave it there, John, and maybe we can do some Q&A.
That sounds good. Thanks so much. And I'll take this time to encourage our audience, if you have questions that have been occurring to you, please drop them in our Q&A, which I will start to look at now. So our first two questions here come from our YCRI co-director, Stephen Smith, and so I'll give them to you one at a time. The first one has to do maybe both with Never Trumpers, but also the opposite side of the party from the 2016 election and subsequently. The question here is, do conservative intellectuals in the Trump side of the party consider the 2020 election another, quote, Flight 93 election, like the Michael Anton essay that I believe you reference in your book? And do you think that for some operatives or other folks in the party that they regarded Hillary Clinton uniquely as fitting in that paradigm, or do they really just apply that paradigm to any Democratic candidate now?
I can start on that. Again, sorry if I've been going in and out with my video. I'm in the, again, COVID world of watching out of children while also doing events at Ivy League universities. So welcome to 2020. So, I mean, one thing to say is, it's sort of a feature of modern America that everything is Flight 93 all the way down, right? It's turtles all the way down. That said, I do think one sort of ironic effect of the replacement of Ruth Bader Ginsburg is it did somewhat lower the stakes of the election. I do think one thing we talk about a lot in the book is how important the Scalia's death was, that then raised the question of the state of the Supreme Court, and then the possibility that if Hillary had won, that there would have been a dramatic reshuffling of the Supreme Court, along with the potential Democratic control of all of the branches. And that really did activate, a lot of the fear centers in many Republicans, right? That made that sort of Flight 93 metaphor really not just seem like an abstraction. And it is important, I think, to recognize that 2016 in particular was a very powerfully apocalyptic election for lots of people, right? It really did seem, and in a way, I think that apocalyptic kind of frame is much more powerful than Democrats this year, right? Democrats, I think, really do believe and really are saying, and I don't think they're just saying this for effect, that they do think of that if Donald Trump wins, then it is 1,000 years of darkness, right? They keep talking in a language of irreversibility, right? That somehow history, and I think this is really what you had in 2016, was the idea that this was not a cyclical phenomenon, right? But this would be a secular break in the trajectory of history that you would never recover from, right? And in some sense, right, I think one important feature of democracy is democracy depends on a certain kind of belief in the cyclical nature of history, right? We need to believe that everybody gets a turn and that anything that's done in one of those cycles of history will be reversible later on. And so we have gotten into a kind of habit of believing that, that the consequences of elections will have this kind of irreversibility. Part of that is because the nature of polarization is to so dramatically alter the character of governance depending on which party's in charge, right? That is, a switch of just one or two, alters entire institutional control. That wasn't really true in the era in which you had much more overlapping parties, and that, the people who were the Democrats who were in control of the finance committee, were somewhat to the left of those of the Republicans, but not that much, right? And control of the agenda was not centrally determined by leaders, right? In that kind of era, you could imagine that even if you lost, you would still have a kind of share of power, which is also, I think, an important element of our general constitutional regime. One of the things that makes it work is the idea that, that we don't have a kind of parliamentary understanding of how our system works, and the minority party is, has a share in governance, right? Well, one thing I think we've gotten to is a system in which the minority party is entirely shut out of governance, and therefore it's possible to believe simply institutionally that you'll be entirely at the whim of the other party, right? Your liberties, your ability to compete politically in the future will all be altered by the other side. So I don't think there's quite the same apocalyptic character, right? I mean, clearly there was something about Hillary that brought out, many of these conservatives had been at war in various ways with the Clintons for multiple decades, right? So Hillary touched something. I'm not generally a psychological theorist of politics, but she clearly touched something very deep and reptilian in a certain kind of Republican mind, right? And I think it's certainly for a lot of the lawyers, right, who ended up being one of these professional groups that was the most likely to go along with Trump, their experience hunting the Clintons among many of those, even as many of them had, very profound reservations with Trump, the combination of the fact that it was Hillary as opposed to the generic Democrat, plus the fact that the whole balance of the court was seen as being at stake, really gave that election this kind of apocalyptic character. And so I do think there was apocalyptic kind of language all around, right? Many of the Trumpers, as Rob mentioned about, especially a lot of Jewish never Trumpers, right, really did think about this election as potentially having, genuinely regime shattering kind of consequences. And again, many of the pro-Trumpers felt the same way, right? And I think one of the questions is, how do you get out of a political system that's going to simply endogenously produce, a permanent sense of an apocalyptic politics? Now, we discussed that a little bit in the conclusion of the book, where we say that there's a possibility, and we also do this in this essay called "The Futurist Faction" that's in the recent issue of National Affairs, that we're likely to see a much more factional future where each of the parties is divided up into deeply organized, distinct sort of sub-brands of the party. And one of the things that those sub-brands are going to want is, at least on some issues, the ability to negotiate and legislate with the other side, because the parties are going to become less ideologically coherent. That might be the kind of thing that can break the sort of central agenda control by parties, the sort of parliamentary parties without parliamentary institutions, that has at least the potential to increase minority party power, and therefore decrease the sense that they'll be entirely shut out of power when they lose.
Thanks for that. So our next question, also from Professor Smith, he says, "I admire the work of the Never Trumpers within the Republican movement. It takes courage to resist your own party. But do you think that Never Trumpers acknowledge their own role in creating Trump? For example, the Sarah Palin phenomenon, which was in many ways a warm-up act, and they potentially had less of a problem or no problem with her own brand of populism. Do you think they let themselves off the hook too easily? Or did you see maybe sort of some self-reflection about their role in the party going in that direction?"
Yeah, I'll take that one too, right? So I do think one thing, so the Sarah Palin thing, Funny, I got asked that question by Yale's own Sam Moyne. So we found the point of intersection between Sam Moyne and Steve Smith, which is itself an accomplishment. One of the things I think that's important to recognize is, I do think to some degree 2012 primed a number of these conservatives, right, to realize that they had played with fire in 2012 with Palin, that they, in a way, had let something out of the basement that should never have been let out of the basement. And so, in a way, Trump was the return of that thing that they had experimented with in 2012, which they had concluded was a disaster, right? That they thought was a terrible idea that they had tried, right? And now they were seeing this back again, right? So in part, one way to think about the Never Trumpers is these were the people who were trying to shove back into the basement the thing they'd let out 4 years before. So, in general politics, very few people come out and sort of rend their garments and beg for forgiveness. And I have seen a bunch, there's a bunch of people who I've, in the discussion of this, who sort of are waiting for a lot of Never Trumpers to get down on their knees and beg for forgiveness. In the same way that people have wanted them, some of the same people actually to beg for forgiveness for their role in the Iraq War, which generally hasn't come. The more consequential thing, which I think is the thing that's consequential for politics, is very few Never Trumpers have really thought in a serious way about how the larger sort of political economy that they helped to construct over years of Republican governance helped to generate Trump, right? And to some degree, some of their national security positions, right? That very few of these Never Trumpers have been that interested in doing really serious rethinking of political economy. There's some of those who were associated with this sort of reformicon movement, like Reihan Salam and Ramesh Ponnuru and a number of people like that. But what's interesting about them is they're the most ambivalent Never Trumpers, right? Because they had been trying to convince the Republican Party for years before Donald Trump's election that they needed to change their approach to economics, that they needed to have an economics that was not so trickle down, that sort of took seriously the economic condition of the Midwest and a lot of all of this other, and it was more pro-family in its economics. And they found themselves continually defeated by many of the other people who were the most avid Never Trumpers. And so many of them had a kind of experience of anger where they hated Trump. They didn't want to support Trump. They didn't want to seem to be apologizing for Trump. And yet they didn't want to have anything to do with these other people who they thought both then produced Trump and then were getting lots of attention for opposing him. And so if there's anything arguably I think they should apologize for, it's for not having done enough before 2016 to realize that that many of the grievances that Trump was going to draw upon would bring a demagogue like him to power. And I think to some degree, they haven't done enough to actually engage in that work of reconstructing the Republican Party's larger approach to political economy since then, right? They've become very Trump-centric. I don't like the language of Trump derangement syndrome, but they're very focused on the person of Donald Trump rather than thinking about the conditions that helped bring him into being. And so I think that's a lot of that sort of tension surrounds those sorts of issues.
So our next question comes from one of our great political science PhD students, Jack Greenberg. So he wants to follow up on sort of the point about the Republican Party strategists, Mike Murphy, Stevens, et cetera. His question is, do these types of folks maybe have some good public relations type opportunities outside of politics moving forward that perhaps could influence their actions? Does the market think their skills are transferable? He's thinking of sort of Obama campaign people who ended up going into prominent positions at Lyft, GoFundMe. And as a related question, the Lincoln Project has LPTV now, and he's wondering whether you think there would be any prospect for Lincoln Project folks achieving anything like a sort of Pod Save America outlet that some of the Obama folks did on the left.
Sure, yeah, I'll take that one. So, you know, I think the key thing to recognize is that Mike Murphy, Stu Stevens, these guys are the exception to the rule. These are the people at the very pinnacle of this profession. They've been doing it for decades. They've had an amazing amount of success. They're very wealthy. And they have a degree of fame, just like there are figures on the Democratic side who've reached the pinnacle of the political world, David Axelrod and James Carville and people like this. But those are not normal people. Right. So those folks, yeah, they have all kinds of opportunities. And, you know, Mike Murphy is a writer in Hollywood. Stu Stevens writes novels. They, you know, they get gigs on cable TV and stuff like that. So one, it's like they don't really need to earn more income necessarily. But two, they have other outlets for it. But that is not normal in the political operative world. Most of these people are, you know, who run, you know, congressional campaigns or do the ads on congressional campaigns or, you know, even state legislative campaigns. You know, these people rely entirely on being in the good graces of the party. And if they step out, and this was absolutely true back in 2016, if you were a never Trumper, I mean, you were on the outs with the party. And of course, after he won, that was only intensified. And so if you're opposed to the party's president, I mean, you're on the blacklist, right? You are not candidates for Congress. They are not going to touch you. Maybe there's an exception, you know, one place or another, but I mean, those people are out of work, and they are not the kind of people who have, you know, PhDs and are just, yeah, like taking a year off from their gig at the university or at the think tank, or get into that revolving door kind of thing of going into government and then going back to AEI or Heritage or whatever it may be. You know, that's just not the case in the political operative world. And we do think that explains a lot of why within that orbit, so many of them were never Trump at the beginning, but then once they saw where things were headed, they recalibrated. They just don't have those degrees of flexibility that the people at the very top, Murphy, Stu Stevens, they have that, but the people below them don't. And the people in some of these other networks that we get into in the book, the foreign policy experts, the public intellectuals, the lawyers, the economists, right? All those groups have a lot more freedom to step out and put themselves out there than do you know, your political professionals.
Our next question comes from one of my great undergraduate students in my presidency course right now, Kevin Zhao. He asks that since we discussed the religious dimension of some of the never Trumpers, he's wondering if you found anything similar potentially for race or ethnicity, given the big tent message of the 2012 autopsy report that you mentioned. So was there any potential variation between the never Trumpers and the rest of the party along racial or other lines like that?
Yeah, I'll take that just briefly. I'm interested to see whether Rob has the same answer I do. I mean, one, you know, it's the unfortunate nature of the Republican Party that, to put it mildly, you don't have a lot of variation on the racial variable. So there's not that many African Americans in the Republican Party, right? Now, I do think that there's a profound racial theme in the book, however, that you especially see among public intellectuals, right? There's a very substantial group of public intellectuals who for a long time have thought that it was, it was critically important that the Republican Party, and especially the conservative movement, had a message for African Americans, right? So these are, you go all the way back to Richard Nixon with black capitalism, which is a term we don't use anymore, but it was very cool at the time. People liked talking about black capitalism. And then it was empowerment for a while, and then it was compassionate conservatism. And, I wrote an article in the first issue of National Affairs called The Eternal Return of Compassionate Conservatism that said, this idea that conservatives should be able to appeal and have something to say directly to African Americans is a recurrent phenomenon. Now, partially it's a recurrent phenomenon for reasons that Rob mentioned before, because you have political consultants in this world who keep saying, it would be really nice if we weren't like spotting the Democrats, the entire African American population every election, right? That would make our job a little easier. We'd be a little bit less of an uphill climb. There are many states that if the Republican Party had 25% of the African American population, it would be very, very hard to beat, right? So there's that, right? But then there's also public intellectuals simultaneously who one, come out of and operate in generally liberal institutions and liberal milieus, right? Universities, Washington sort of policy discourse, journalism, right? And their message has almost always been that conservatism has a better answer to the problems that liberalism has identified, right? The state, inequality, poverty, upward mobility, racial discrimination, right? All of those, right? That one of the messages of the conservative public intellectuals has been that liberal ideas don't work for African Americans, for Hispanics, right? And so part of their argument has always been, therefore, that conservatism needed to speak directly to African Americans. It needed to have a positive message about, and that goes, all the way back to the Reagan administration with things like empowerment zones, which keep getting they keep getting resurrected from the dead as opportunity zones. It's the same kind of thing, right? School choice is a perennial thing that keeps coming up. And that's in part because I think many of these people do believe that the legitimacy of their movement is properly evaluated by whether or not it's simply a movement of white people, right? That they really reject the idea that this is a fundamentally racial movement, right? Now, thought of through that point, that perspective, you can see why Donald Trump would be so repulsive, right? Because much of what he was doing was saying, oh, all that stuff is all a bunch of bull, right? All that stuff about, in a way, he was more directly saying that, in fact, the Republican Party was a movement of white people, right? And he was giving up on the idea. Now, again, in a way, what's interesting is he's reconstructed through the Diamond Plan, which is sort of an interesting way to put it, right? Donald Trump in 2020 has tried to say that he's done lots of things for African Americans and that he ought to have an appeal. So even Donald Trump has tried to reconstruct, and again, his thing actually looks much more like Nixonian black capitalism. But I do think that the perception that Donald Trump was playing with very live ammo in sort of racial animus in 2016 really did for them threaten to reinforce everything that liberals had said about conservatives, right? And that's one of the reasons why I think their response to Trump was so intense to the point of opposing their own party's nominee.
Our next question comes from my fellow postdoc at YCRI, Brendan Shanahan. So he notes that some scholars have pointed to high legislative hurdles which impede putting often anti-immigrant ballot measures before voters in Texas to help explain the longevity of the Republican Party's strength in Texas compared, for example, to the GOP's abrupt decline in California. Can we think of any similar structural models at the federal level that could mediate the types of policies or candidates that the GOP puts before voters? So maybe to summarize that, do you think that never Trumpers or other folks might have ideas about sort of restoring a bit more of a mediating role for party elites in the way that you've both sort of described historically, especially.
Yeah, I mean, so on the one hand, you do have to wonder, given the degree to which the Republican Party's institutional structure has been Trumpified, whether empowering those mediating structures would be a good idea now that they're controlled by him and people who came in with him. So I think that's one thing to say off the bat. The other point goes again back to our premonition maybe of a future of factional parties, that one of the best ways to constrain the potential demagogic nature, or at least the demagogic threat of parties in the American system, is to make them more bargaining type structures, right? So one of the things that factionalized parties do, by the fact you have organized groups inside them that are able to engage in collective action and are able to insist on a certain degree of discipline, but that can also support their members, is that would make it a lot easier for party members to oppose leaders of their own party when they disagree with them, right? So one thing we've seen that's a regular feature of this period is people standing up to Trump, criticizing him as Republicans, and then they all get their head chopped off, like people in World War I coming up out of the bunker, right? Now, part of that's again because they're doing all that as individuals, right? They're not acting as a collective that would be able to exercise pivotal power. And that's what factions can do, right? Even a disciplined group of 4 or 5 Republican senators who said that they just weren't going to have anything to do with this president, right? And that they were going to act as a blocking mechanism to force McConnell to negotiate with him, would be potentially powerful, right? But McConnell and Trump and the whole rest of the Republican structure were able to deal with dissent when it was individualized, right? And so on the one hand, I would say that's one thing that the Never Trumpers, when there were more Never Trumpers in the Senate, right? When there were, or at least people who were critical of Trump, never really did, right? Ben Sasse always stood up and, said sweet things and made people think, oh, what a nice boy John, Ben Sasse is. He's not like that terrible Donald Trump, right? But he never did anything. He never organized anything. He never got 3 or 4 of his other members together to do a blood oath and swear that they were going to, act together, even if in some cases it would block their own party's agenda, right? They never did that, right? And therefore, in some sense, all of their sweet words were more or less meaningless. And I do think that's one thing that, again, if there's a criticism of the politicians who are never Trump, is that was in many cases, this was more about preserving their own purity or reputation of purity than it was about actually acting as a coherent force to stop the things they said they disliked about Trump and his administration.
So I'd like to follow up. Oh, go ahead, Rob.
I'd just say that I think it extends beyond just the politicians. A lot of the activities that the Never Trumpers have been engaged in since 2016 have been, kind of cross-partisan efforts about kind of do-gooder efforts about improving democracy and things of this nature, which are all fine and good, I suppose. But in a way, that's much easier than what I think Steve and I agree on is the more important work of kind of fighting for the soul of the party, or at least fighting for a piece, a foothold within the party, because this audience doesn't need to be told that the two-party system is pretty well baked into the cake of the American political system. And so if you're going to have a foothold within that, it's going to be through one of the parties. And, I'm often reminded of David Frum also often has a good way of putting things. And this was one, he said something to the effect of, look, it doesn't, we were asking him, well, like, why don't you just leave the Republican Party and go join the Democrats or start a third party or something? And he said, well, look, I've always been on the right. And it also doesn't do any good to have a two-party system in which one party is committed to democratic norms and all of that kind of stuff. This is where I'm needed, and I'm not leaving. I'm going to fight for it. And not many of the Never Trumpers took that attitude. And you know, I think there's still a chance for that. And that is kind of the thing Steve and I spin out at the end of the book and in the national affairs piece. But it's not inevitable. It's going to take people who are willing to engage in the gritty, long-term efforts of fighting it out inside of a political party. And like I say, a lot of the Never Trumpers have kind of abandoned that ground. And of course, I can totally sympathize with that decision. I mean, I get why you wouldn't want to fight it out in the trenches with the Trump loyalists, but one wonders if they aren't willing to do that, where they're going to have any influence. It's just hard to have that outside of one of the parties. And you know, another thing maybe worth mentioning on this point is that there are models out there for what this might look like, right? There's this guy, Charlie Baker, up in Massachusetts, not far from you all. There's Hogan in Maryland, right? So there are these examples. Now, what those people have not done yet, you know, those are just kind of cults of personality kinds of things, but they have demonstrated that there is an interest on the part of the voters, particularly in strong democratic states where the democratic socialist wing of the party might be particularly strong. There is an appetite in those areas for what we might think of as kind of adult supervision of the legislature, right? So there is a space out there. What hasn't occurred yet, and what we think would be a good thing if it did, is to actually have that be more than just Charlie Baker fan club and Larry Hogan fan club, and actually have it be a coherent thing, an institution like the Democratic Leadership Council back in the 80s and early 90s. Right? Something along those lines where you get branded as, you know, a DLC Democrat, which is meaningfully different in important ways that people recognize from, you know, a Michael Dukakis Democrat or whatever. You know, that's a kind of thing that, you know, it would be nice to see develop within the Republican Party, and the Never Trumpers are, you know, in a good position to lead such an effort. But it's hard. It's hard work, and it's easier to, I think, engage in some of the activities that they have engaged in the last few years.
So to follow up on both of your answers to this, one thing that I keep thinking of both in reading your book and in listening to the discussion about intra-party groups is the APD Congress scholar Ruth Block Rubin's book, Building the Block, which talks exactly about how the only way for an intra-party group or brand to get influence in Congress is to have people pair together collectively. And Steve, you mentioned, for example, that Sass or Corker or Flake didn't do that. They sort of let themselves take their own individual stands. So I'm wondering, maybe looking forward, do you see any prospect for the party operatives that have been Never Trumpers to maybe take a role in trying to persuade potential legislators in the Republican Party to engage in that kind of constructive work? I mean, Mitt Romney, as you've said, might be the obvious example on the Senate side of something, but I'm curious what you think about the prospects for something like that.
Yeah, no. I mean, so now I'll give a slightly more subtle answer than no. I don't actually think that this will start in Congress, right? I think it'll start outside of Congress, right? And because one of the problems is if Trump really gets beat and the Republicans really get beat as badly as it looks like they will, right? One of the things that's going to happen is their more moderate, right, which is a relative term now, but members are the ones who are gonna get pushed to the wayside, right? So there's gonna be even, it's not gonna be the most right-wing Trumpy members who are gonna lose, right? It's gonna be the people precisely who you would imagine might have been supporters of a bloc like this, right? I also don't, when you think about Ruth's book, which is a great book and everyone should read, and Ruth, by the way, was my undergraduate student at Brandeis. The thing I guess I would say is that one advantage that especially like the Freedom Caucus had, which Ruth discusses, is there was a big organizational foundation for them, right? That is, they, underneath of them was like the entire Heritage Foundation, right? The Heritage Foundation had basically aligned itself with the Freedom Caucus, right? So they had an enormous foundation of money, of ideas, of networks of organizations, of activists, right? All that was underneath them, right? Factions are not, like Marx would say, built on air, right? They're built on an actual material organizational foundation, right? And so in part, the real challenge, and this is the real, I think Rob and I say this in the book, the real shame of the Never Trumpers is how little of a faction they've built in the 4 years since they lost in 2016, right? That is how little of that durable, specifically partisan organizational infrastructure they've created. And again, part of that was because of how obsessed they were in their hatred of Donald Trump specifically, right? Now, for some of them, that led them to simply view the Republican Party as so diseased that they didn't want to have anything to do with it, right? So many of them responded to Trump by effectively defecting from the party, right? And many of them, as Rob said, thought we were in an emergency, so they spent their time investing in cross-party democracy and supporting kind of organizations. But what that meant that was lacking were organizations who could build that foundation of a financial, ideational, organizational, mobilization, all those things that politicians need to see underneath them if they're going to be willing to take the risk of engaging in collective action inside of legislatures, right? So, and that's one, I'll say that's a problem often in political science with how we study Congress. We often study Congress as too detached from society, right? That is, we often have theories that are very internal to explain what's going on in Congress, as opposed to looking at the ways that Congress straddles state and society. I think, what's his name at Princeton? Julian Zelitzer's book, America's Congress, not America's Congress, his book on Capitol Hill, which is his book on the transformation of Congress in the 60s and 70s, is actually very good at this, right? About how social movement building outside of Congress helped drive internal transformation inside of the organization of Congress, right? And I think that's a way to think about where these sort of organized blocks in Congress will come from. They come because they're connected to various things out there in society and in organizations.
So another question that we have in the Q&A here is about the Trump impeachment and how so many in the Republican Party and maybe the broader party infrastructure referred to it as a sort of attempted coup, made repeated references to, an attempt to take Trump off the ballot and remove a duly elected president. So can you talk a little bit from your experience speaking with them, where precisely the Never Trump folks stood on impeachment, and presumably a lot of them agreed with it, but maybe what some of their thoughts were about the impeachment effort and how the Democrats undertook it?
Yeah, well, I would say most of the Never Trumpers were enthusiastic about the impeachment effort. I mean, there are always quibbles about Oh, things like whether it should have been broader in scope, whether they should have looked at other things. But I mean, I think you find all of those views on the Democratic side too. So I don't know that there's any unique kind of never Trumper perspective on impeachment per se, but certainly, I mean, they tend to think, I mean, to speak broadly of the group, that there were many impeachable offenses, and I think it was another one of these moments, and there have been so many, where they were just profoundly disappointed at you know, the lack of Republicans in Congress who would go along with it, right? And there was, I mean, I don't think any of them quite ever got to the point of thinking there was a real chance that Trump was going to be removed when the articles of impeachment finally came. But there was still considerable frustration that at the end of the day, you know, Mitt Romney is there all by himself. And I think they did hope that there would be, you know, some of the folks Steve mentioned earlier, you know, maybe Ben Sass and, you know, or Collins and Murkowski and, you know, all the usual suspects, you know, but it's just one of many instances like this where, you know, it's been disappointing and disillusioning. And I think that's also fed into this mentality that's made it hard for them to think seriously about forging a real intra-party faction, is that they just, at every turn, they feel abandoned, they feel betrayed, and they feel like this is not their party anymore. And so that's no doubt been part of the reason why it's why I think they've shied away from some of that activity that we think would have been more productive for them to undertake.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say on that. I mean, I do think a lot of them thought. So I do think there was a couple of things going on that we haven't mentioned, right? In a way, I think there was a little excessive Boy Scoutness that was involved in this, right? There were a number of people who just thought, you know, this is something we have to do. Trump's obviously gone over the line. If we don't do this, then, you know, history will judge us, kind of stuff, which, you know, we're all political scientists, so we're all supposed to be too hard bitten to believe that. But I do think many of these people actually literally did believe that, and that somewhat suppressed their strategic judgment on that. The other thing is, right, you know, impeachment is a little bit like buying a lottery ticket, right? That is, you go into it, and I think many of them thought once you opened up Pandora's box, all these horrors will come out, right? And you know, they didn't get quite as many horrors out of Pandora's box as they thought they would. The other thing, though, is I was sort of surprised at how few, you know, there were a number of never Trump Republican lawyers, right, who had been organized around this organization called Checks and Balances. And it was surprising to me that Democrats didn't try to sort of take advantage of their presence to put them front and center in impeachment. I really think that actually would have been a good idea, right? Some of them, you know, there were people who had been acting attorney general of the United States in Republican administrations who were among them, right? There was a lot of those kind of people, and having them actually do some of this sort of prosecution, I could imagine, you know, would have sent a different message, right? It might have had a little bit of an ability to cut into that image that this was an entirely partisan witch hunt, right? Now, again, it may have not worked, but what the Democrats did, we know didn't work. So I had the advantage of having not having to argue with what actually happened on my side here.
So one question that I'd like to ask about your book, I think one of the most fascinating and important takeaways of it is the role of party professionals and operatives in preserving the norms of a well-functioning democracy. You've mentioned that a couple of times today. And obviously we've heard so much in the last 4 years and seen how Trump has challenged norms about presidential power, democracy, other things, and the extent to which co-partisans in Congress have gone along with that. So I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit more about why you think these non-elected officials are specifically so critical to maintaining norms. And then a little bit of a philosophical question. Do you think it's a healthy sign of democracy that we need to rely so much on maybe non-elected officials to be the norm preservers in some ways?
Good question. Steve, you should take this one.
Why me?
well,
one of us want it.
You were the one who specifically had an idea about how to address it. Get into the that stuff we threw into the intro chapter on this.
Yeah, I mean,
so conservative parties in general.
Yeah, so I mean, it is certainly the case that I'll just say that in general, most democracies turn out to be highly institutionally embedded, right? That no democracy works directly. All democracies depend upon an infrastructure of social, civic institutions. They depend on the performance of professional associations. They depend upon, in some cases, the character of the civil service, which we often don't take as an important institution in civil society. Many, I wrote a paper on a while back that noticed that, Herbert Storing, the great Straussian American politics scholar, had written an entire article in defense of bureaucracy, where he said that actually a civil service could be a very important break on the passions of a democratic populace. So at least in this way, it goes back to the point that Rob was making, that we come out of a particular tradition when thinking about American politics, one not alien to your own center, right? That thinks that democracy is a problem, right? That thinks that the role of the public directly in governance is potentially a problem, right? And it needs to be surrounded by all kinds of institutions and processes and norms in order to work, right? That's what Tom Pangl called the things that ennoble democracy, right? And that democracy does need ennobling, right? Democracy in some cases can be ennobling, right? The process of participation can actually bring out important virtues, but it can also bring out important vices, right? And education is, by the way, one of those important institutions for the ennobling of democracy. So in our understanding of liberal democracy, the thing that we come out of, this is not a particularly surprising or shocking claim that democracy needs elites, it needs institutions, it needs processes, it needs norms, it needs law, it needs all of these things in order to work. So that's my answer. I'm sticking to
it. So perhaps as a final question for us here as we approach 5:30, I'm going to combine two questions from Stephen Smith and from Jack Greenberg. And we've talked about this a little bit, but a prediction perhaps from you both about what exactly is the future of the Never Trumpers. Obviously that partly depends on the election result, but what do you think they might do next under a potential Biden administration? And what role do you think they might potentially play, if any, in a 2024 GOP presidential primary? Are there other Republican politicians that they might also be never somebody, for example?
Yeah, I mean, so just to go, remember, we organize this by professional group, and I think that's the right way to think about them, right? I think that I don't think most of the political professionals, especially the ones who are most active in Lincoln Project, these are going to be like, wasps that sting and then die. So I think there's something to, whereas, I think some of the national security people, I can imagine coming back in a future, more normal Republican administration, if there is one, right? That's not out of, and in a Biden administration, I don't think there's going to be a lot of room in a Biden administration for any of these people. That's very hard for me to imagine. I do think Biden, being the kind of person he is is going to want to appoint some kind of at least nominally Republican person to his cabinet. You know, he's already talked a little bit about Jeff Flake at one point. He'd have to find a position for him. But obviously Biden is under very strong pressure to maintain his own internal factional balance inside of his party in a way that makes, you know, formally giving something to these never Trumpers, you know, a very hard thing to do, right? I think in some cases, many never Trumpers may have more of a role in state politics. In fact, I think if they were smart, they would focus on, you know, Connecticut, Massachusetts, you know, a number of states that on the one hand have a base of less Trumpy Republican-ish voters and have a Democratic Party that's going to have a strong temptation to overdo it by moving to the left and therefore providing an opportunity for Republicans to actually govern and to govern in a sensible way and then create a power base in a number of states like that. So again, I would not look for a lot of opportunities for them in a Biden administration, but I would look for lots of opportunities for them as Republicans in places where the Republicans are not particularly competitive.
Yeah, and I'd just add quickly, you know, a lot of the people we talked to recognized that their time in government was over, or at least that's what they told us. I mean, maybe they still cling to hopes of going back in, but a lot of them would tell us, you know, look, I've had my turn, and now given what happened in 2016, the time has passed and it's not going to happen. But I think the one other thing about, you know, looking to the future and a potential role for never Trumpers, it might matter a great deal how bad Trump's loss is, assuming that he does lose, right? If it's kind of a narrow thing, you know, it's very possible that the Trumpists look at that and say, well, gosh, without the pandemic, you know, everything was going just fine, but then this pandemic came in and screwed it up. On the other hand, if it's but that would kind of be a stay the course kind of model, and there would be something, you know, that's an argument that could have some legs. On the other hand, if it's a total repudiation, if it's you know, kind of the 1980 wave in reverse kind of thing, you know, I would think there might be some space for real serious rethinking, not just of the particular individual in the White House, but the whole Trumpist approach. And that could create some openings for the never Trumpers to get back in the mix, or at least try to work towards putting together the kind of faction that Steve and I think would be worthwhile for them to focus their energies on.
Well, we'll obviously see what the election result is, hopefully fairly soon here, which will determine a lot of what happens next with the never Trumpers. I'd like to thank you both, Rob and Steve, so much for this really interesting talk that covers so many important themes on parties, norms, the role of ideas in politics. I think we've all been really enriched by it. So thank you for that. I do want to remind our audience participants that our next Zoom virtual event in this series will again be 2 weeks from today, November 12th, with Verlin Lewis, continuing on the theme of sort of parties, their ideologies, and in his book, it's focusing on party control of institutions. So please look out for that event. Again, thank you, Rob and Steve, so much. This has been great. And everybody out there, please go vote.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, John.